Think about the professional basketball we enjoy today. You know, the incredible athleticism, the fast pace, the high scores. It's almost hard to imagine it any other way.
Yeah, it really is.
But the journey of this sport in North America has been, well, anything but static. It's a story of constant evolution, driven in large part by changes to the very rules of the game. And that's what we're diving into today.
Absolutely. We're going to be exploring a fascinating research article from the Journal of Sports and Games by Mahmoud M. Narai. This piece offers a fantastic historical perspective on pro basketball, focusing intently on those pivotal rule changes that have shaped its entire history.
Right. So our goal today is to really dig into these key rule modifications. We want to understand the reasons behind them. Was it to inject more excitement for the fans,
Sure.
to get those scores climbing, or perhaps to curb some of the more aggressive aspects of the early game?
Yeah, all of the above, probably.
And ultimately, we want to see how these tweaks have collectively molded the sport we recognize now. What's so revealing is how this historical look underscores the league's continuous efforts to cater to the fans and, let's be frank, the financial health of the game.
Definitely.
Okay, so to understand where we are, we have to go all the way back to the beginning.
Let's indeed. Basketball's inception in 1891, thanks to Dr. James Naismith, was as a gentler indoor activity, to combat the harsh winters, a contrast to the more physical football.
Right.
His original 13 rules were very much geared towards a less violent game. Take rule number 9, for example, which gave only 5 seconds to get the ball back in play when it went out of bounds, a simple way to maintain momentum.
Okay.
And rules 5, 6, 7, and 10 were specifically designed to limit excessive physical contact between players.
A violence-free version of what's now a major professional sport. It almost feels like looking at a completely different game.
It kind of does, yeah.
But it's true. The initial professional leagues started popping up mainly in those urban centers on the East Coast. And then you had these incredible traveling teams, the Barnstormers, like the legendary Harlem Globetrotters, captivating audiences wherever they went.
Oh, yeah, the Globetrotters were huge.
Simultaneously, college basketball was taking hold, with early competitive matchups between schools like Yale and Minnesota. Here's where it gets really interesting. That early college game, often officiated by less experienced referees, became quite physical.
Right.
This led to public outcry, and remarkably, President Theodore Roosevelt himself got involved, which ultimately spurred the formation of the Intercollegiate Athletic Association in 1910.
That public concern over the physicality in the early game is a crucial element. And as the sport evolved, so too did the equipment and some fundamental rules aimed at boosting safety and the flow of play. Initially, they were using actual peach baskets.
Peach baskets.
Yeah, which of course had closed bottoms, meaning someone had to manually retrieve the ball after each score.
Oh man, imagine the delays. That switch to rims must have sped things up considerably.
Oh, hugely. In 1892, they transitioned to wire rims, a significant step, followed by the more durable cast iron rims in 1893.
And then there was the issue of what happened when the ball went out of play. The original rule, granting possession to the first team to touch it, often resulted in, well, more of that physical entanglement they're trying to minimize, right?
Exactly, and slowing the game right down.
Yeah.
Precisely. So to address that and inject more pace, they introduced wire cages around the perimeter of the court. This is where the term cagers for the players originated.
Ah, okay, cagers.
Later, rope cages became more prevalent, particularly in the Northeast, and remained a feature for decades.
Wild. And scoring in those early days wasn't quite what we're used to.
Not at all. The free throw rule came into effect in 1894, and the free throw line was initially set way back at 21 feet from the basket.
21 feet, wow.
That was quickly adjusted to a more familiar 15 feet the following year, and to prevent fans from getting too involved, shall we say.
Interfering, yeah.
They added the wire mesh backboard in 1895. That evolved over time to wood, and eventually the plate glass we see in arenas today.
What's fascinating is how these seemingly minor adjustments really underscore a continuous process of refining the game.
Totally. And talking about scoring, initially, both field goals and free throws were worth just a single point.
Just 1 point.
It wasn't long before they increased the value of field goal to 2 points, even before 1896. This is a clear attempt to inject more dynamism and, naturally, more points into the contests.
Then, the realities of the wider world began to intrude, with the impact of World War I and then the devastating stock market crash of 1929. Attendance figures suffered, and a lot of teams were forced to fold.
Tough times.
But from that period of struggle, In 1925, the American Basketball League, or ABL, emerged, supported by smaller corporate entities. This really lays the groundwork for the more prominent professional leagues that would follow. So what can we take away from these early years? A sport still in its formative stages, constantly adapting its rules to enhance the game itself and broaden its appeal.
Exactly. And as we move into the 1930s and 40s, we witness even more significant rule innovations aimed at further energizing the game. The introduction of the midcourt line in 1932 was a direct response to teams using stalling tactics to run out the clock.
Ah, the stalling.
It compelled the offense to advance the ball past halfway, again with the intention of boosting scoring opportunities.
Right, no more simply holding on to the ball indefinitely once you had a lead.
Pretty much.
And that was further enforced by the addition of the 10-second clock, which put a time constraint on getting the ball across that midcourt line.
Yep, got to cross in 10.
Then, in 1936, the 3-second rule in the key was introduced. A truly pivotal change designed to alleviate congestion and reduce the physical play directly underneath the basket. How did this fundamentally alter the game in the paint over time?
Well, the 3-second rule forced offenses to be more creative than just parking a big man under the basket,
Yeah.
Defensively, it meant teams couldn't just camp out in the key either. Over time, this rule contributed to the development of more perimeter-oriented offenses and more agile post players who could move in and out of the key effectively.
That makes sense. More movement. And what else was happening in the 30s and 40s?
Well, it's also worth noting the formation of the Midwest Basketball Association in 1935. It's interesting to see corporations like General Electric, Firestone, and Goodyear backing this league, which eventually evolved into the National Basketball League, or NBL.
Right, the NBL.
This corporate involvement highlights the growing recognition of basketball's commercial viability.
Absolutely. And public enthusiasm for the sport received another significant boost with the U.S. men's basketball team's success at the 1936 Olympics.
Big moment.
Plus, the NCAA National Championship, which we now know as March Madness, began in 1939, really igniting those collegiate rivalries and capturing fan interest.
Yeah, March Madness starts to take shape.
Even the basketball itself was undergoing changes, becoming easier to grip and control, with molded balls replacing the older stitched versions in 1942 for a more consistent feel during play.
However, this period wasn't without its challenges. The years surrounding World War II saw a decline in professional basketball attendance, and by 1945, several struggling ABL teams decided to join the more stable NBL. This consolidation reflected the evolving professional landscape.
And then we start to see the emergence of those early dominant big men like George Mikan and Robert Kurland in the early 1940s.
The Giants arrive.
Yeah. Their sheer size and ability to block shots and engage in goaltending started to have a significant impact on scoring, often leading to lower scoring contests. How did the league respond to this emerging dominance?
This is a classic example of how exceptional player talent can necessitate rule adjustments. In response to their influence in the paint, the goaltending rule was officially introduced in 1944, again with the primary aim of improving the flow of the game and increasing scoring opportunities.
So no swatting it away right at the rim anymore.
Exactly. Let the ball have a chance to go in.
Kurland even earned the moniker the first regular dunker and was a dominant force in those NCAA championships. Interestingly, he initially opted not to turn pro, choosing to compete in the Olympics instead.
Yeah, different path.
But Mikan, on the other hand, entered the NBL in 1946 and immediately propelled his team, the Chicago American Gears, to a championship. It's fascinating how this relatively short-lived Professional Basketball League of America, or PBLA, ultimately folded, which actually benefited the NBL.
Right, consolidation again.
And then you have the Detroit Gems relocating to Minneapolis, becoming the Lakers, drafting Mikan, and suddenly another championship in 1947-48. Mikan was clearly a transformative player who influenced the game on and off the court.
Undeniably. And his dominance and the league's response to it really sets the stage for the next pivotal development, the birth of the NBA.
Okay, so the late 1940s are a watershed moment. We see the establishment of the Basketball Association of America, or BAA, in 1946. What was the thinking behind its creation?
Interestingly, the BAA was primarily founded by owners of ice hockey teams.
Oh, okay. Makes sense.
They were looking for ways to utilize their larger arenas during the hockey offseason and strategically targeted those bigger city markets. Maurice Podoloff, who is also the head of the American Hockey League, took on the role of president.
So right away, you had a competitive environment with the established NBL, both leagues vying for players, and crucially for fans. How did this competition play out?
Well, this competition for talent and fan loyalty ultimately led to a significant shift after the 1947-48 season, with four prominent NBL teams, including the Minneapolis Lakers, Fort Wayne Pistons, and Rochester Royals, deciding to leave and join the BAA.
Big names jumping ship.
Yeah. Then, in 1949, the BAA further expanded by absorbing more teams from both the NBL and even the ABL.
It sounds like a period of intense maneuvering and consolidation within the professional basketball landscape.
Very much so. A real scramble.
And the culmination of all this movement was the merger in August 1949, when the remaining 6 NBL teams joined forces with the BAA to officially form the National Basketball Association, the NBA, with Maurice Podoloff still at the helm.
There it is. The NBA is born.
They started with 17 teams, and you're right, some were still located in smaller towns with less modern facilities.
Podoloff's vision was very much in line with the BAA's original strategy, to consolidate teams in those larger urban centers that had better arenas, the aim being to attract bigger audiences and establish a more robust financial foundation for the league.
But it wasn't exactly a smooth start to this new era, was it?
No, not at all.
The early years of the NBA saw quite a bit of team instability, with franchises folding or relocating. By the mid-1950s, the league had contracted from that initial 17 down to just 8 teams.
Yeah, a lot of teams didn't make it.
But amidst this early turbulence, one team remained a dominant force. The Minneapolis Lakers, still led by the incredible George Mikan, who had guided them to that 1949-50 championship. His impact on the game was still profound.
And Mikan's continued dominance while bringing success to the Lakers ironically began to present a challenge for the league's overall appeal. His sheer influence often led to predictable game outcomes.
Right.
And consequently, fan interest started to wane. That infamous 1918 game between the Lakers and Fort Wayne in 1950 really brought this issue into sharp focus.
1918.
Yeah, the Pistons coach, Paul Birch, essentially instructed his players to just hold on to the ball to limit Mikan's impact, stalling.
In a professional basketball game, you can only imagine the reaction from the paying customers. Boos, probably.
Oh, for sure.
And Maurice Podoloff clearly recognized this as a significant threat to the long-term health of the league. He understood the pressing need to inject more excitement back into the game for the spectators.
Absolutely. His response was a significant one. For the 1951-52 season, the lane under the basket was widened from 6 feet to 12 feet.
Doubled it.
Yep. While often linked to Mikan's presence, this change, alongside the existing 3-second rule, was intended to open up the paint, creating more opportunities for smaller, quicker players to drive and score more easily.
Okay.
The underlying strategy was clear. Increase the pace of play, lead to higher scores, and ultimately enhance fan appeal.
And shortly thereafter, in the 1953-54 season, the NBA secured its very first television contract. You can see how these various elements were beginning to align efforts to create a more dynamic and watchable product for a growing audience.
Getting on TV, yeah, big step. But perhaps the most transformative rule change to address the slow pace came in the 1954-55 season with the introduction of the 24-second shot clock.
The shot clock. This is huge.
This innovation is largely credited to Daniel Biasone, the owner of the Syracuse Nationals. It mandated that a team had to attempt a shot within 24 seconds of gaining possession of the ball. What was the immediate impact of this single rule?
It was revolutionary. That single rule fundamentally altered the game's tempo. Suddenly, that deliberate, stalling style of play became virtually impossible.
It's gone overnight.
And the immediate effect on scoring was dramatic. Average scoring jumped by almost 10 points that very season and surpassed the 100-point mark the following year. It's often said that the 24-second clock is what truly saved professional basketball.
It undeniably injected a much-needed sense of urgency and excitement. And even after Mikan's retirement in 1956, the league experienced increased attendance throughout the late 1950s, largely fueled by the emergence of new iconic players like Bill Russell,
Celtics dynasty.
whose Boston Celtics dominated for over a decade, and the arrival of the phenomenal Wilt Chamberlain.
Wilt the Stilt. And while those dominant centers continued to exert a major influence, the late 50s and 60s also saw the rise of incredibly skilled guards like Elgin Baylor and Jerry West, showcasing a more versatile game.
True, the guards were getting spectacular too.
But a significant development on the league front was the formation of yet another competing league, the American Basketball League, or ABL, in 1961.
The ABL attempted to distinguish itself from the NBA by introducing some intriguing rule variations, including a three-point line set at 25 feet,
The three-pointer appears early.
a shorter 30-second possession limit, and a wider 18-foot lane. It was an experiment to offer a different, perhaps more wide-open style of play. However, it ultimately proved to be short-lived, lasting just over a season.
A brief but interesting experiment. Meanwhile, the NBA was continuing its own expansion and evolution, adding its first official expansion team, the Chicago Packers, in 1962. And in 1964, they widened the lane once again, this time to 16 feet, a move often attributed to Chamberlain's continued dominance in the paint, further trying to create more space for offensive players.
Dealing with Wilt, yeah. And all of these gradual changes were contributing to a steady increase in scoring throughout the 1960s. By 1960, every team in the NBA was averaging over 100 points per game.
Scoring was definitely up.
The league also steadily increased the number of regular season games, which naturally provided a boost to revenue.
Makes sense. More games, more money. Then in 1967, the NBA added the Chicago Bulls. But that same year marked the creation of another significant challenger in the professional basketball landscape, the American Basketball Association, or ABA.
The ABA arrives, red, white, and blue ball.
Exactly, with none other than George Mikan serving as its first commissioner.
Mikan again.
The ABA adopted a different strategy, targeting those Southeast markets that the NBA had largely overlooked and embracing the three-point shot, a rule they adopted from the defunct ABL. What impact did the introduction of the three-pointer have on the game's strategy?
Well, the three-pointer was seen as a way to potentially level the playing field, giving smaller, perhaps less physically imposing players a significant offensive weapon.
Right, stretching the floor.
It also had the immediate effect of forcing defenses to extend further out, opening up driving lanes, and creating more spacing on the court, which could lead to more exciting and higher-scoring games.
The ABA definitely cultivated a different kind of energy and style. And as the NBA continued its own expansion in the late 60s and early 70s, adding teams like the San Diego Rockets, Seattle Supersonics, Phoenix Suns, and Milwaukee Bucks.
Cream's Bucks?
The ABA provided real competition for both player talent and fan attention.
Yeah, the leagues were battling. By the mid-1970s, the NBA had expanded further, bringing in teams like the Portland Trail Blazers, Cleveland Cavaliers, and the New Orleans Jazz. And then came the significant news in 1977. The NBA-ABA merger.
The merger, huge moment.
It was a landmark event that reshaped professional basketball in North America.
How did this merger impact the league? Well, the merger essentially consolidated the top professional basketball talent under one banner, strengthening the NBA's overall position. The NBA absorbed 4 ABA teams, the San Antonio Spurs, Indiana Pacers, Denver Nuggets, and the team that would eventually become the Brooklyn Nets.
The Nets, right?
Bringing with them exciting players and that ABA flair, including the now mainstream three-point shot.
So the three-pointer finally comes to the NBA officially. Now, we transition into an era often characterized by the dominance of centers. Think about the incredible talent that graced the league during this time. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, Moses Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, Shaquille O'Neal.
Just a list of legends.
Frank Deford famously observed that a dominating center in basketball can exert more control over a game than almost any other individual player in any other major sport. What were the strategic implications of having such dominant figures in the paint?
They became the focal point of their team's offenses, often leading to a more deliberate, post-up-oriented style of play.
Feed the big man.
Exactly. Defenses would often double-team these centers, which could create opportunities for cutters and outside shooters, but the overall pace of the game often slowed down compared to earlier eras.
Despite this big man era, the NBA did officially adopt the three-point shot in 1979, finally integrating that ABA staple into its rulebook.
Finally adopts it.
However, the high-scoring games of the 1980s were more often attributed to the fast-paced Showtime Lakers and their captivating rivalry with the Boston Celtics.
Magic versus Bird. Epic.
Interestingly, even though the total number of field goal attempts was actually trending downwards during this period, their field goal percentage was remarkably high, reflecting efficient offensive execution.
That Lakers-Celtics rivalry was undeniably a golden age for fan engagement. But as the 80s drew to a close, the game began to evolve again, often towards a slower, more isolation-heavy style of offense.
Iso ball.
With an increased emphasis on post-up plays and more physical, defense-oriented strategies. This shift led to a noticeable decline in overall scoring across the league. How did the league attempt to address this?
Well, the league responded with further rule adjustments. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, they made tweaks to the 24-second clock reset rule after fouls were committed.
Fine-tuning the clock.
And in 1981, they introduced a revision to the free throw rule with the 3 to make 2 concept in certain fouling situations. It's interesting to consider whether that particular rule, while intended to perhaps disincentivize fouling, might have inadvertently contributed to lower scoring and even encouraged more physical play in some instances.
Unintended consequences, possibly. It's a complex equation, isn't it?
It really is.
By the late 80s, concerns about the level of physicality in the game led the league to add a third referee to the officiating crew in the 1988-89 season, with the hope of better controlling player conduct on the court.
Trying to clean it up a bit. And the concern over excessive physical play and even violence escalated into the 1990s. The league began to implement stricter measures, including increased financial penalties and more severe ejection and suspension rules for fights and altercations, making a clear effort to improve the game's image, particularly leading up to the 1993 playoffs.
Getting tough on fights.
Then, in 1994, facing that continued downward trend in scoring, the league implemented some significant rule changes aimed at boosting offensive production. They temporarily shortened the distance of the three-point line,
Moved it in.
increased the number of free throws awarded for fouls committed on three-point attempts, and eliminated hand-checking in the backcourt and above the free throw line. Can you explain what hand-checking entailed before this change and why limiting it was seen as a way to open up the court?
Sure. Before the rule change, defenders were allowed to maintain physical contact with an offensive player, using their hands and forearms to impede their movement, especially on the perimeter. Guiding them, bumping them off their path.
Right, being really physical. By limiting hand-checking, the league aimed to give offensive players more freedom to drive to the basket and create scoring opportunities, as defenders couldn't be as physical in disrupting their dribble or cutting movements.
That makes sense. It was all about trying to create more space and flow for the offense.
Yeah.
But even with these changes, overall field goal attempts and scoring continued to dip.
Didn't quite work as hoped, maybe.
So in the 1997-98 season, the three-point line was moved back to its original distance.
Moved it back out.
They also further clarified the parameters of the no-charge zone under the basket and explicitly disallowed the use of the forearm by defenders to impede offensive players. Yet the downward trend in scoring persisted, reaching a notable low point in the 1998-99 season.
Scoring was still lagging. That continued decline prompted further adjustments in 1999, including a refinement of the shot clock reset rule and the introduction of the 5-second rule for post-up players.
5 seconds backing down.
This 5-second rule was specifically designed to prevent offensive players from simply backing down their defender in the post for extended periods without making a move, again with the objective of speeding up the offensive action.
Which brings us to the modern era, the 2000s and onwards, where the primary emphasis really shifted towards creating more offensive flow and freedom.
Big shift coming.
The league established a select committee, chaired by Jerry Colangelo, specifically tasked with reviewing and revising the rules to increase the overall speed and offensive dynamism of the game. Colangelo himself spoke about the game becoming too stagnant and predictable due to defensive strategies.
Yeah, they felt something fundamental needed to change. The key rule changes that emerged from this committee were quite impactful. The introduction of the defensive 3-second rule.
Defensive 3 seconds, that's new.
The elimination of the more intricate illegal defense guidelines, which effectively allowed for zone defenses.
Allowing zones, basically.
And reducing the time allowed to advance the ball to the midcourt from 10 seconds down to 8 seconds. Stu Jackson, then the NBA's senior VP of basketball operations, explained that the old illegal defense rules had become overly complex for both officials and fans, and the goal was to encourage more player and ball movement rather than isolation plays.
Okay, so what was the underlying philosophy behind allowing more zone defense? Why did they think that would help?
Well, the thinking was that by allowing zone defenses, it would force offenses to become more creative in their ball movement and player spacing to find open shots. It was intended to move away from the reliance on individual matchups and encourage more team-oriented offense, less one-on-one pounding.
More passing, more cutting.
Exactly. And these changes had a clear intended outcome: to perhaps lessen the dominance of traditional back-to-the-basket big men, increase the overall tempo and pace of the game, and generate more opportunities for smaller, skilled perimeter players. Even coaches like Steve Kerr have publicly acknowledged the positive impact of these rule modifications in fostering greater pace and more fluid offensive action.
We really saw the impact of these new rules with teams like Mike D'Antoni's Phoenix Suns, who famously popularized that 7 seconds or less offensive philosophy.
Oh yeah, the Suns were electric.
They achieved considerable success by pushing the ball up the court quickly, capitalizing on their shooting abilities, and fully embracing the newfound freedom of movement. This approach, in turn, influenced other teams to adopt more of a small ball style of play, emphasizing versatility and perimeter scoring.
So, reflecting on this comprehensive journey, it's evident that the league has consistently employed rule changes as a strategic tool to try and enhance fan engagement, increase television viewership, and ultimately drive financial success.
Always circling back to that.
Former NBA executive Rod Thorne and Stu Jackson have both emphasized that the core objectives of these rule adjustments have been to elevate scoring and mitigate excessive physical play.
And we can clearly see the impact of these modern rules on contemporary offensive strategies. There's a much greater emphasis on constant player movement, more frequent drives to the basket resulting in layups and kickouts.
Yeah, lots of drives.
A decrease in isolation plays and slower post-up sequences, and a significant promotion of five-man offensive schemes characterized by more fast breaks, and of course, a proliferation of three-point shooting, as Portland coach Kerry Stotts has observed.
The three-ball explosion. However, these changes haven't been met with universal acclaim. Some coaches and veteran players, including figures like George Karl, Jason Kidd, Hubie Brown, and even the legendary Larry Bird, have expressed concerns.
What are they saying?
They argue that the heightened emphasis on perimeter play and speed is leading to a decline in traditional post-up skills and the art of the mid-range shot.
Lost arts.
And that the game, in their view, is becoming somewhat softer with an over-reliance on the three-point shot. Bird famously quipped about teams needing to shoot an excessive number of threes.
Kiki Vandeweghe, who served as the league's former senior vice president for basketball operations, has pointed out that modern statistical analysis strongly supports the efficiency of three-point shots and taking advantage of early shot clock opportunities, which is a significant factor driving the way the game is currently played.
Analytics taking over, yeah.
And despite some nostalgia for the more physical style of earlier eras, the NBA has experienced substantial financial growth, fueled by those lucrative television contracts and ever-increasing salary caps.
The money keeps pouring in. It's also interesting to note the emergence of alternative leagues like the BIG3, which, with its different rules, including a more physical style of play, and even its inclusion in the Tokyo Olympics, raises the question of whether there's a substantial appetite for a different brand of professional basketball, and if it could ever pose a real competitive challenge to the NBA.
Yeah, the BIG3 is interesting. A different flavor. This deep dive really illuminates that constant dynamic throughout basketball's history, that ongoing effort to strike a balance between entertainment, competitiveness, and the continually evolving skills of the players through the strategic implementation of rule changes.
Absolutely. These changes are a direct reflection of the league's ongoing responsiveness to fan preferences and ultimately the economic realities of the business. It's always been about adapting.
Definitely. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Given this rich and fascinating history of rule changes in professional basketball, what future modifications might we witness?
Good question.
And what will be the primary forces driving those potential changes? Will we see a pendulum swing back towards a more physical style of play, or will the current emphasis on speed, spacing, and the three-point shot continue to shape the game's evolution? It's certainly a compelling question to